Hello guys. It surely has been a long time since I've posted, right? But today is going to be the last day of the meditation series where we wrap it up on meditation 6. I'm still debating if I want to cover the objections to the meditations. And if I do, then it will be another long series, but today will be the end. Meditation 6 concerning the existence of material things and the real distinction between mind and body. Now let's get started. Okay, so in this last meditation, Descartes is looking into whether material physical things actually exist or not outside of his, perception. But he only knows that they can only potentially exist because they are the objects of mathematics. So he once again introduces God, right? And says that if he can clearly and distinctly perceive something, then God is able to bring that into existence. And because God is not a deceiver, because it would impossible for God to be a deceiver, because that would imply a contradiction. And so if God exists and is not a deceiver, then Descartes' clear and distinct perceptions of mathematical objects are able to be true. There's just no reason to doubt their possible existence, right? God couldn't have deceived Descartes. Now, hold up. Descartes also looks at the faculty of imagination as a possible proof of material things, and he says that he uses this faculty of imagination when looking at material objects. And so he defines imagination as a certain application of the knowing faculty to a body that is intimately present to it. Basically, this is what he's saying. Imagination works by applying the mind to a body that exists. But Descartes also gives us a very important distinction that we have to take note of, which is pure intellection versus imagination. Consider the example, imagining a triangle versus understanding a triangle. When Descartes imagines a triangle, he understands that it is a figure bounded by three lines, adds the angles inside add up to 180 degrees, and he also sees those three lines as if they were present before him. And this process of mentally seeing the figure is what he calls imagination. And consider another example, imagining a chiliagon versus understanding a chiliagon. A chiliagon is a polygon with 1,000 sides, but Descartes can understand what a chiliagon is just as easily as he understands a triangle. But he cannot imagine it in the same way because when he tries to imagine it, his mind doesn't form a clear picture of 1,000 sides, but instead he forms a confused representation that is not meaningfully different from what he would imagine for a myriagon, that is, a 10,000 sided polygon, or any large sided shape. And so, by distinguishing between imagination and understanding, Descartes shows that the ability to form mental images is not something that is essential to the mind, which thus means that imagination requires something external like that of a body. Alright, so understanding, that is, intellection, is a purely conceptual thing and it does not require mental images. But imagination requires additional mental effort, as evident when the complexity of an object increases, like a chiliagon or a myriagon, right? And now Descartes looks at another explanation that involves us supposing that there is a body to which the mind is intimately joined. Now, if the mind could turn to this body and use it as a basis for forming images, this would explain how imagination works. In this case, imagination is just simply the mind looking toward the body, while pure understanding is the mind looking within itself. But Descartes says that if a body does exist, then imagination could possibly be explained in this way. But this is only a probable conjecture, and he says this is not definitive proof. Now, Descartes says that colors, sounds, tastes, pain, etc. belong to material things and bodies. These are different from the objects of pure mathematics because they are not perceived distinctly. And if imagination depends on the body, while understanding does not, this suggests that the mind and body are distinct entities, which is a foundational principle within Cartesian dualism. in which Cartesian dualism is basically the mind-body distinction. Now, Descartes suspects that they come from the senses and not the imagination faculty. So the senses appear to relate to material things, and so Descartes wants to see if they can prove the existence of material things. But already establishing the existence of God, if material things can be known with certainty, it must be because God allowed him or allowed Descartes to know that these things exist. So Descartes states that he previously sensed that he had a head, hands, feet, and other body parts that he viewed as a part of himself, and that his body existed along with other bodies in the world, and his body could be affected in many ways, either positively or negatively. And by positively, Descartes means sensations that bring pleasure, and negatively, sensations that bring of pain. Now, besides pleasure and pain, he also sensed internal bodily states, such as hunger, thirst, and other appetites. He also sensed emotional states, like sadness and anger. But externally, he sensed qualities like extension, shape, and motion of bodies, hardness, heat, light, colors, odors, tastes, and sounds. But all these sensory qualities were immediately present to his mind, and so it was natural for him just to assume that these sensory perceptions came from external things that were distinct from his mind, because sensory ideas came upon him without his consent. He had no control over whether or not he sensed something when it was present to his sensory organs. Also, he could not sense an object if it was not present to a sensory organ. And so, not only that, Descartes saw that the sensory ideas were more vivid and explicit than ideas he deliberately formed through meditation or found stored in some memory. And because these sensory perceptions felt stronger and more vivid and clearer, it seemed impossible that they originated from within his own mind. And so from this, Descartes concludes that they must come from external things. And Descartes said he had used his senses before he used his reason, and he saw the ideas in his own mind were less explicit than sensory perceptions, and were based off of sensory perceptions. But he came to doubt sensory perceptions for many reasons, in which they sometimes produced unreliable data. But unfortunately, even though Descartes previously believed that because the senses did not depend on his will, they must come from external things. And so he realized that just because perceptions do not depend on his will does not mean they come from external things. Perhaps some unknown faculty within him was generating these perceptions. Sounds like a whole epistemic problem here, right? But now that he has gained a better understanding of himself and of God, he no longer rejects the senses entirely, but neither does he accept them without question. And so this is the important part. Descartes asserts that, upon reflection, the only thing that necessarily belongs to his essence is thinking, right? And he can doubt the existence of his body, but he cannot doubt the existence of his mind, since doubting itself is thinking, or is a form of thinking. He contrasts his understanding of himself as a thinking thing with his distinct idea of body, which he understands as merely an extended thing, that is, something that occupies space and has physical properties. And since he can clearly and distinctly understand his mind apart from his body, it then follows that they are truly distinct and that he can exist without a body. Now, Descartes turns his focus onto where these sensory ideas come from. This is where Descartes again distinguishes things. Now, in this case, it's passive versus active faculty. And since Descartes already knows he has a passive faculty, it thereby follows that there must also be an active faculty that produces sensory ideas. Now, please note that this active faculty is not in Descartes. And so sensory ideas arise without his consent and even against his will at times. And sensation does not involve an active understanding on his part, and so therefore it must come from something outside him. There are possible sources of sensory ideas, and some of them are going to be corporal things, God, and some other non-corporal but created being, or intelligent substances like an angel. Now, Descartes argues that the source of sensory ideas must be material things, and not God or spirits. Because if sensory ideas that came directly from God or some other spiritual being, then God would be deceiving him, since he has a natural inclination to believe that they come from physical things. But, again, it is impossible for God to be a deceiver, and so certainly this is not going to be the case. And so Descartes says sensory ideas have to come and must come from actual material objects, and they do. And Descartes gives us a caveat, and a caveat is just a warning. And he gives us a warning that while material things exist, they might not actually appear or exist exactly how they appear through the senses, since sensory perceptions can be confused or obscure. But mathematical properties of bodies are reliable because they are things that are clearly and distinctly understood, and whatever is clearly and distinctly perceived is true. And so Descartes says that even if the senses deceive sometimes, they still give real information about the world. Because the senses reliably indicate that he has a body and that material things exist, mathematical properties of bodies such as extension, shape, and motion are still going to be true. These are mathematical properties. But they are unreliable. The senses are unreliable because of some certain stuff. This is evident in particular judgments about sensory properties. For example, the size and shape of the sun, the nature of light and sound, and these can be unclear or misleading, and the senses are sometimes deceptive. For example, when you're looking at optical illusions. And prepare your eyes for the next slide of rotating snakes. Okay, in this optical illusion, these are rotating snakes, and the image is just an image. It's not moving, but it appears to be moving. And my senses are telling me that they're moving, but they're really not moving, right? And so this is just one way to show you how sometimes the senses can be deceptive. Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at it right now, and it looks like every snake is spinning to me, but when I look at one specific one, it's not, and then when I don't look at another one, it's moving, right? Pretty cool. If you want to look it up, I think it's called it's a rotating snakes, but you can find more illusions like the line illusion. I think that's what it's called. Okay. But having distinguished the body from the mind, Descartes states that his sensations of pain, hunger, thirst, and similar bodily experiences show that he is not just merely connected to his body in the way how a sailor is to a ship, because they really have no real connection, but rather that he is deeply joined and intermixed with it. Because if this was not true, he would not directly experience pain when the body is injured. He would not simply perceive the injury. He would simply just see it as intellectually, right? And in the way that a sailor perceives damage to a ship externally rather than experiencing it internally, he would have to also understand his body's needs through reasoning instead of a sensation, which is kind of absurd. These sensations of hunger, thirst, and pain are not just intellectual perceptions, they are confused modes of thinking, which arise from the union between the mind and body, and these sensations function as signals that guide him towards what is necessary for the body's well-being. In this book, Descartes also clarifies what it means to be taught by nature. In the broad sense, it just means the entire system of created things bestowed upon by God. And in the narrow sense, it means the specific way in which he, as a being composed of both mind and body, is guided to seek pleasure and avoid pain. And Descartes says that nature does teach him to pursue things that cause pleasure and avoid things that cause pain. And it also does not teach him to make conclusions about the external world, except where the intellect independently investigates reality itself. And so sensory perceptions do not inherently lead to truth, and so the intellect must conduct investigations before drawing conclusions about external objects. Huge argument from rationalism, by the way. Now, even though Descartes has already established that God is perfectly good and thus not a deceiver, a new issue arises where if nature, which is given by God or created by God, sometimes misleads people. For example, making poison taste pleasant. Does this mean God has deceived them? No. Descartes says no, because nature does not actually deceive. It only merely guides humans towards what seems beneficial or good. And if someone is misled, for example, consuming poison due to its taste, it is only because nature only directs them toward what tastes is good, and not because it gives a perfect knowledge of the substance or thing itself. And Descartes also claims that even our inclinations can lead to error. For example, some sick individuals desire food or drink that will harm them, right? And the human body is like a machine. It is a mechanical system composed of flesh and bone, nerves, muscles, etc. Even without a mind, the body would still perform many of the same functions, except for those actions requiring conscious will. This means that many bodily functions are automatic, governed by purely physical mechanisms. Now, Descartes also makes a distinction between the meanings of nature again, but in this case, it's about intrinsic and extrinsic nature. Extrinsic nature is comparison based, and it's not a real thing. Consider the example. When we say a sick person's body is corrupt or a clock is malfunctioning, we are comparing them to an ideal, that is, a healthy person or a well-made clock. Now, intrinsic nature, as evident from its name, is real and essential. This refers to the actual properties and laws governing things, and regardless of human judgment, these things are still going to be true. And now the question pops again. How can God's goodness allow for errors in nature? And this is Descartes' literal response. The explanation is that human nature is limited. And so that's what it means to be created as an infinite. Not an infinite. Of course, we are not infinite. This is what it means to be created as a finite, limited being. Humans are finite beings, and so it is unreasonable to expect them to have perfect perception or understanding. Now, going back to the body, Descartes once again makes a distinction between them because the body is divisible but the mind isn't. And so any physical object, including the human body, can be divided into parts. When the mind is examined, it doesn't appear to be composed of separate parts. The mind is not something tangible. You can't just touch it, and it's not physical. It's something totally different. It's abstract. So how is the mind connected to the body? Now, the thing is, the mind does not receive signals from every part of the body independently. Instead, it is connected to the brain. This is where all sensory inputs are processed before being perceived by the mind. Then, common sense in the brain is really just referring to a central point in the brain where different sensory inputs converge. And when this part of the brain is stimulated in the same way, it presents the same perception to the mind no matter what the cause of the stimulation is. And so the body transmits sensory signals through nerves, just like how pulling on one end of a rope communicates and moves to the other end. Consider a basic example, pain in the foot. Pain in the foot is caused by nerves stretching from the foot to the brain. And that's basically the end. This is to sum up the whole meditations, not the whole meditation, meditation 6. This is the last meditation, and thank you for watching. It's been a good series.